Love identifies the true Christian congregation. Should we expect all members of a congregation to be perfect? Were the apostles and early Christians perfect? Well, is it really possible for any of us to be perfect today? Well, obviously not. So love, not perfection, identifies the true Christian congregation. Let's have a look at John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. So that's John chapter 13. And we're going to look at verses 34 and 35. I am giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love among yourselves. But some confuse love and perfection and expect too much of others. They use the imperfections of others as an excuse for stumbling. So, do you expect perfection of others? And what should you expect to see in the Christian congregation? Turn with me, please, to Romans chapter 14, verse 4. So that's Romans chapter 14, verse 4. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for Jehovah can make him stand. So, love is the foremost identifying mark of true Christians. Love is the surpassing way, and it was more important than special gifts of spirit that first century Christians had. Let's have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're looking at verse 31. But keep striving for the greater gifts, and yet I will show you a surpassing way. Now, love sums up the entire law. And love is even greater than faith and hope. Let's have a look. If you're still in 1 Corinthians there, let's just have a look at chapter 13 this time and verse 13. It says there, Now, however, these three remain, faith, hope, love. But the greatest of these is love. Now, let's just have a look there at Romans chapter 13. And we're going to look at verses 9 and 10. So that's Romans 13. I'm going to look at verses 9 and 10 there. For the law code, you must not commit adultery, you must not murder, you must not steal, you must not covet. And whatever other commandment there is summed up in this saying, you must love your neighbour as yourself. So you can get the gist of that there, can't you? Now, Paul reminded Christians that they owed love to one another. Now, if you're still in Romans there, let's just have a look at verse 8 of chapter 13. It says there, do not owe anything to anyone except to love one another. For whoever loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. So, since love identifies the true congregation, we need to learn how to apply love in response to daily situations and, of course, problems as well. To help us to do that, we need to consider the first century Christian examples, don't we, from the Bible. So, first century Christians were not perfect people, but they showed love. Imperfections were evident even among the apostles. Jealousy, ambition, and lack of humility showed up on a number of occasions. For example, let's have a look at Matthew chapter 20. That's Matthew chapter 20. I'm sure you know what we're going to look at here, but let's just look at verses 20 to 28. Then the mother of the son Zebedee approached him with her sons, doing obeisance and asking for something from him. He said to her, "What do you want?" She replied to him, "Give the word that these 2 sons of mine may sit down, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom." And it goes on to say there, Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking for. Can you drink the cup that I am about to drink?" They said to him, "We can." He said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup, but to sit down at my right hand and at my left is not mine to give, but it belongs to those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." When the 10 others heard about it, they became indignant with the 2 brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and the great men wield authority over them. This must not be the way among you, but whoever wants to become great among you must be your minister, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister, and to give his life as a ransom in exchange for many." So we can see there that lack of humility that arose with the disciples there. But why did they act that way? Well, by inheritance, humans incline to think more of themselves than they ought to think. Now let's have a look at Romans chapter 12 again. So that's Romans chapter 12. And we're going to look at verse 3. "For through the undeserved kindness given to me, I tell everyone there among you not to think more of himself than it is necessary to think, but to think so as to have a sound mind, each one as God has given to him a measure of faith." So that's fine scriptural counsel there, isn't it? So the world tries to cultivate a sense of superiority, getting ahead of others. But the disciples had been reared in Jewish religion, which stressed position or rank in all its dealings. So we should not be surprised that at times imperfect humans are disposed to seek position and prestige. Peter, though prominent, had to be corrected several times. He was rebuked by Jesus for wrongly motivated thinking. Now let's just have a look at Matthew chapter 16, just for an example here. So that's Matthew 16, and we're looking at verses 22 and 23. At this, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Be kind to yourself, Lord. You will not have this happen to you at all." But turning his back, he said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, because you think not God's thoughts, but those of men." Another example was when he boasted of his supposed superior faith and standing before other apostles. But then, practically immediately afterwards, he then denied Jesus 3 times. And we'll have a look at that account if you like. It's again in Matthew, and we're going to look at chapter 26 there. So we're going to look at verses 33 and 34 of chapter 26. But Peter, in response, said to him, "Although the others are stumbled in connection with you, I will never be stumbled." Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, on this night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And of course, as we know, that is what happened. He refused to follow the instructions from God and was corrected. Let's have a look at Acts chapter 10, verses 14 to 16. So that's Acts chapter 10, 14 to 16. But Peter said, "Not at all, Lord, because I have never eaten anything defiled and unclean." And the voice spoke again to him the second time, "Stop calling defiled the things that God has cleansed." This happened a third time, and immediately it was taken up into heaven. So he yielded to fear of men and showed partiality to Jewish converts. Though having been instrumental in conversion of the first Gentiles to Christianity, and was corrected by Paul. Let's have a look at Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. That's Galatians chapter 2, and we're looking at verses 11 to 14. However, when Cephas came to Antioch, I resisted him face to face because he was clearly in the wrong. For before certain men from James arrived, he used to eat with people of the nations. But when they arrived, he stopped doing this and separated himself, fearing those of a circumcised class. The rest of the Jews also joined him in putting on this pretense, so that even Barnabas was led along with them in their pretense. But when I saw that they were not walking in step with the truth of the good news, I said to Cephas, before them all, if you, though you are a Jew, live as nations do and not as Jews do, how can you compel people of the nations to live according to Jewish practice? So we see there, don't we, that even true Christians are not superior in being perfect. They are all imperfect, just as we are today. Now, Jesus continued to use Peter prominently despite his imperfections. Let's have a look at John chapter 21, verses 15 to 17. So that's John chapter 21, verses 15 to 17. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He replied to him, "Yes, Lord, you know I have affection for you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." Again he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I have affection for you." He said to him, "Shepherd my little sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you have affection for me?" Peter became grieved that he asked him the third time, "Do you have affection for me?" So he said to him, "Lord, you are aware of all things. You know that I have affection for you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my little sheep." So we see there, don't we, that Jesus was giving Peter the privilege of being a shepherd towards Jesus' sheep-like ones. Now, Peter's deep love and other fine qualities outweighed his imperfections. Let's have a look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22 there. So that's 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22. Now, interestingly, this says, "Now that you have purified yourselves by your obedience to the truth with unhypocritical brotherly affection, as a result, love one another intensely from the heart." Now, Paul, though exemplary in love and devotion, had imperfections. Paul and Barnabas were prominent elders, and they had a sharp burst of anger over a small matter and parted company. You find this in Acts chapter 15. So in Acts chapter 15 there. And we're looking at verses 36 to 41 there. Acts 15, 36 to 41. So that says there, "After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us now return and visit the brothers in every one of the cities where we proclaim the word of Jehovah, to see how they are.' Now Barnabas was determined to take along John, who was called Mark. Now Paul, however, was not in favour of taking him along with them, seeing that he had departed from them in Pamphylia, and had not gone with them to the work. At this there was a sharp burst of anger, so that they separated from each other, and Barnabas too took Mark along and sailed away to Cyprus. So even Paul and Barnabas, who were well respected, had imperfections. However, love prevailed in spite of imperfections in the congregation. Now let's have a look at the scripture here in 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're going to look at verse 8. So that's 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. Above all things, have intense love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. So in all these cases of imperfection, love covered a multitude of sins, indicating that the disciples had love among themselves. The Philippians showed genuine love toward Paul in spite of his imperfections. Now, let's have a look at Philippians chapter 4. So that's Philippians chapter 4. And we're looking at verses 15 and 16. In fact, you, Philippians, also know that after you first learned the good news when I departed for Macedonia, not a congregation shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you alone. For while I was in Thessalonica, you sent something to me for my need, not just once, but twice. So we see there, don't we, that despite Paul's imperfections, the Philippians showed genuine love towards him. Now, the true mark of love covered over the mistakes of prominent ones who we might feel should have known better. How would you have been affected by the mistakes of the apostles as recorded in the Bible? Would you have stumbled, or would you have forgiven them in love? Well, Christian love covers imperfections. True Christians imitate their Creator in his love for mankind. They do not wait for fellow Christians to be perfect before showing love to them. We must have a balanced view of our relationship with one another. We can't expect too much from each other, can we? Because of inherited imperfection, all are inclined to do wrong. Let's have a look at Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. That is why, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin. And so death spread to all men, because, and here's the point, they had all sinned. So there's not one perfect person amongst us. Within us is the tendency to be envious, to become provoked, to brag, to be unforgiving, and so forth. Though all must work to overcome such tendencies, sinful inclinations will find expression among Christians. Let's have a look at Ecclesiastes chapter 7. So that's Ecclesiastes. Now we're looking at chapter 7. And we're going to look at verses 21 and 22. Also, do not take to heart every word that people say, otherwise you may hear your servant calling down evil on you. For you well know in your heart that many times you yourself have called down evil on others. So if we can't expect much of ourselves, we can't expect much of other people as well. So to expect perfection of our brothers or of ourselves is unrealistic and will only lead to disappointment. Paul's description of love shows how we can deal with one another in recognition of one another's imperfections. Let's have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. So that's 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and we're looking at verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous. It does not brag. It does not get puffed up. It does not behave indecently. It does not look for its own interests, does not become provoked. It does not keep account of the injury. It does not rejoice over unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So those are important words to consider there, isn't it? So love is long-suffering and kind, and it gladly puts up with the idiosyncrasies and differing opinions of others. It is not harsh, but kind, respectful. And as we saw, it does not become provoked. There may seemingly be reasons for becoming provoked, but imperfections of others are reasons for applying love. And as we saw, it says there that it does not keep account of the injury. Yes, there will be injury, and we need to expect that, but we need to be ready to show love in response. It would be unloving to harbour grudges or review how certain ones have sinned against us. Intense love helps members of a congregation to cover over mistakes committed by overseers who are also imperfect. Now, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17 tells us, if we have a look at that, that's Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. Now that's quite interesting here, because that tells us something quite important here, because it says there, "Be obedient to those who are taking the lead among you, and be submissive, for they are keeping watch over you as those who will render an account, so that they may do this with joy and not with sighing, for this would be damaging to you." So it encourages obedience to those watching over us, even though that they are imperfect. So we need to follow the way of love despite imperfections, our imperfections, and also the imperfections of others. Now, the true congregation is no longer identified by gifts of spirit, but by love that never fails. Though not condoning wrongdoing, we need to be liberal in showing love that covers a multitude of sins. As part of a true Christian congregation, we need to heed Peter's counsel. And he says there, above all things, have intense love for one another. Now we find that in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. So what have we learnt here then? Well, one of the most important things I think that we've learnt here is the identifying mark of true Christianity. Now that is love, and it is not perfection. So we've also learnt the importance of that love, that it's more important than hope and faith. And, we see there, don't we, that it is the very foundation of a Christian congregation. And we've also learnt, quite good detail there, haven't we, how the first century Christians were not perfect people, but yet they showed love and forgiveness towards one another. We've also seen how Christian love can cover imperfections of others. And we need to follow the way of love despite imperfections, not only from ourselves, but from other people in the congregation. So, I will ask you this question for you to ponder. Do you have love that identifies you as a true Christian? If you would like a free home Bible study at a time and place to suit you, please navigate your browser to jw.org and follow the links online. Thank you for listening.